They called it Hinterkaifeck, a lonely farmhouse nestled in the wintry woods of Bavaria, Germany, so secluded it was nearly invisible on a map. The dirt path leading there twisted through trees that looked like sentinels, guarding secrets they'd never reveal. By the spring of 1922, this isolated stretch of land had become home to fear, suspicion, and, soon, murder. The Gruber family had lived on the farm for years. Andreas Gruber, the family patriarch, was a stern and unpopular man, known to beat his animals and perhaps even his kin. His wife, Kazilia, quiet and withdrawn, kept mostly to herself. Their daughter Victoria lived there with her own children, 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Yosef. The last resident was their newly hired maid, Maria Baumgartner. She had just arrived on March 31st. She wouldn't survive the night. But this wasn't a sudden horror. The darkness had been building for weeks, like a thick fog creeping in just below the surface of everyday life. Several villagers reported strange happenings around the farm in the days leading up to the murders. Unexplained footprints were found in the snow, leading to the house, but none leading away. The Grubers had spoken of hearing footsteps in the attic. A set of keys went missing. A newspaper appeared in their home that no one remembered buying. And there were whispers, always whispers, that something wasn't right in the Gruber house. Andreas, stubborn and proud, never contacted the police. He chalked it up to imagination or paranoia. But perhaps, deep down, he knew better. Perhaps he even knew who or what had invaded their home. Victoria was a different story. Some say she was ready to flee. Others claimed she had secrets of her own, dark ones. She had once tried to leave Hinterkaifeck with her daughter and had even traveled to Munich in hopes of starting a new life. But the past always seemed to pull her back like quicksand. There were rumors in town, rumors that her 2-year-old son Yosef was not fathered by her late husband, who had died in World War I, but by someone closer, much closer. Possibly even her father, Andreas. These weren't just village gossip. A court case in 1915 had already convicted both Victoria and Andreas of incest. Though they served short sentences, the scandal clung to the family like a disease. It was a stigma that refused to die, and one that could have bred hate in the hearts of others. Yet it was the final week of March when things truly turned strange. Neighbors noted that Victoria had stopped attending choir practice. The mailman grew concerned when letters piled up. The local mechanic who'd been scheduled to repair their farm machinery showed up to find no one answering. He called out into the cold silence, walked around the barn, and then left, unnerved. The family had seemingly vanished, but no one in the village could have guessed the truth. They hadn't vanished. They were inside, all of them, dead. The murders would not be discovered until April 4th, 1922, 4 days later. And during that time, someone had been in the house. The livestock had been fed. The chimney released smoke. Fresh meals were found in the kitchen. A neighbor even swore they saw someone moving through the shadows behind the barn. But when they approached the property, it fell into a cold silence. Only when the local school teacher noted the absence of young Kazilia did a proper search begin. What they found inside Hinterkaifeck would disturb even the most hardened villagers. But before the blood was discovered, before the barn was opened, before the bodies were dragged into the daylight, there was only quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel empty but occupied. The kind of quiet where the air itself holds its breath. That was the final silence of Hinterkaifeck. An unease blanketed the home like frost on the windowpane. Inside there were signs of life continuing. Beds still unmade, food half-eaten, laundry mid-fold, but no laughter, no cries, no footsteps. Just the sense that something watched from the attic rafters, waiting, listening, breathing. For the villagers of Kaifeck, life in 1922 was hard, but it was predictable. You farmed, you prayed, you gossiped, and sometimes you suspected your neighbors. But never did you expect a massacre. Certainly not one so brutal, so methodical, and so close to home. And as the sun set on March 31st, no one in the surrounding fields could have imagined that an entire family was being stalked from within, that one by one, they would be led to their deaths in a quiet barn under the moonlight. That blood would soak into the soil they had toiled for years. That a killer would move among their bodies, perhaps whispering to them, perhaps humming, and that no one would ever hear their screams. On the morning of April 4th, 1922, a cold wind swept across the Bavarian countryside, as it often did in early spring. But in the village of Kaifeck, that morning felt heavier, strangely still. Something was off, and then it came. The school noticed that little Cecilia Gruber had not been in class for several days. That alone might not have raised alarm. Children got sick, families got busy. But combined with other unsettling signs, it triggered concern. The local postman, too, had his doubts. He'd passed by the Gruber property several times recently. The mail, usually collected promptly, sat untouched. And what about the blacksmith who was supposed to repair their equipment? He'd shown up, knocked for over 20 minutes, even circled the property, but left after hearing nothing, seeing no one. The Gruber farm had gone eerily silent. That morning, a small search party of neighbors approached Hinterkaifeck, walking cautiously up the dirt path. The cold still clung to the air. A few stray chickens pecked around the yard. The cows mooed faintly inside the barn. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. They knocked. No answer. They called out. Still nothing. They entered the barn first, and that was when the horror revealed itself. 4 bodies lay there, brutally stacked on top of each other, partially covered in hay and straw. At first, they weren't even recognizable. Blood had soaked into the dirt floor, staining it a deep, unnatural brown. The faces were shattered, nearly obliterated by blunt force trauma. One of the villagers gagged. Another stepped back, whispering a prayer. The first body belonged to Andreas Gruber, the family patriarch. His skull had been smashed repeatedly with what would later be identified as a mattock, a farming tool with a long handle and sharp metal head. Next was his wife Cecilia, then their daughter Victoria, and finally little Cecilia the younger, just 7 years old. But what truly haunted those who saw them wasn't just the brutality, it was the way they'd been found. Lured, it seemed, one by one into the barn, then murdered methodically and stacked as though they were no more than harvested crops. Their fates unfolded not in a moment of chaos, but with chilling patience. The searchers rushed into the main house, praying against hope that someone, anyone, might have survived. But inside, the horror continued. In the maid's room lay Maria Baumgartner, dead in her bed, still in her travel clothes. She had only just arrived at the farm the day before the murders, her first day on the job. Someone had crept in while she lay down to rest and killed her without a sound. Then came the most heartbreaking discovery. In the nursery, lying still in his crib, was 2-year-old Josef. His skull had been crushed. A blanket had been pulled up gently over his broken face. The farmhouse was soaked in silence, but this silence wasn't empty. It felt suffocating. A presence seemed to cling to the walls, and an awful realization crept in. These murders hadn't been quick. They hadn't been frenzied. They had been careful. Investigators arrived from Munich, accompanied by forensics men, local police, and members of the press. But what they found made things even worse. In the 4 days since the killings, someone had been living inside the house. Fresh bread had been cut. A fire had been lit in the hearth. The animals had been fed, watered, and milked. Even the dog had been taken care of. It was as if the killer, or killers, had stayed, slept in the victims' beds, walked through their rooms, cooked with their utensils, lived among the dead. Worse, in those 4 days, curious villagers had come and gone, trampling the scene, disturbing evidence, touching everything. Some even cut pieces of the crime scene as souvenirs. By the time the authorities tried to secure the area, it had already been contaminated beyond repair. The medical examiner was horrified. He found that many of the victims had been killed by repeated strikes to the head with a sharp-edged object, likely the mattock that was later recovered hidden in the attic. Several skulls were caved in entirely, but it was the young girl, Cecilia, who suffered the most haunting fate. She was found with chunks of her own hair ripped out, a sign she may have survived the initial blow and lived in agony for hours before dying. Her hands were clenched tightly in fists of hay, as though trying to crawl her way out from under the bodies. This wasn't just a murder, it was a massacre, and it had been carried out with rage, control, and, perhaps most disturbingly, familiarity. Whoever did this had known the layout of the home. They'd known how to move quietly, how to avoid alerting all the victims at once. They had planned. And yet they had not stolen anything. Jewelry remained. Cash was untouched. Valuables sat in plain sight. This was not a robbery. This was personal. The horror spread quickly. Papers across Germany printed the story. Murder farm, they called it. Some blamed gypsies, others whispered of madmen. Some even blamed the victims themselves. But in Kaifeck, the villagers began to look at each other with suspicion. Could the killer be among them? Was it someone who came by often? Or worse, someone who never left? When police searched the attic, they found signs that someone had indeed been staying there. Bedding, a crude lantern, a hole in the wall that looked down into the bedrooms below. The theory began to form. Had someone been living in the attic, watching the Grubers for days or weeks before striking? The footprints in the snow, the missing keys, the sounds in the ceiling, all the warnings they ignored. Had death been inches away the entire time? As the sun began to set on April 4th, the Grubers' bodies were carried out of the house and laid in the yard. The neighbors watched in silence as the corpses were loaded into carts. The wind howled. A baby cried in the distance. Nothing would ever be the same again. The Gruber farmhouse, once a place of hard work and quiet living, had become a monument to cruelty, and as investigators packed up, photographers snapped their final frames, and villagers made the sign of the cross. One question burned in every mind. Who had done this? And more terrifying, were they still watching? In the days following the gruesome discovery at Hinterkaifeck, the investigation began. But even in its earliest moments, it was clear. This would be no ordinary murder case. The crime scene had already been trampled, the evidence contaminated, and the killer, or killers, had vanished into thin air. The villagers of Kaifeck were no longer just witnesses. They were suspects. And everyone had a theory. The Munich police took over the investigation, dispatching Chief Inspector Georg Reingruber to the scene. He arrived to chaos. Curious townsfolk still loitered outside the house. Children peeked through windows. Some villagers even admitted to having entered the house in the days before the bodies were discovered, just to look around. Some confessed to touching things. Others took keepsakes. A few had even walked into the barn and seen the bodies, yet told no one. The first question was obvious. Who had the motive to wipe out an entire family? Investigators began with the person closest to the family, the father, Andreas Gruber. He had a long history of brutality. By all accounts, Andreas was cold, violent, and despised by most of the community. Rumors about his incestuous relationship with his daughter Victoria had circulated for years, even confirmed by the courts in 1915. Both Andreas and Victoria were jailed for it, briefly, but they returned to the farm afterward as if nothing had happened. It was widely believed that Josef, Victoria's 2-year-old son, was not the child of her late husband, but her father's. A grotesque possibility, one that stained the Gruber name forever. Could the motive have come from within? But if Andreas had been the killer, that didn't explain the sequence of the murders, or his own death. He was among the first victims, lured into the barn. The killer had moved deliberately, drawing each member out one by one. It suggested patience, planning, intimacy with the family's routines. So police turned their attention outward. Lorenz Schlittenbauer quickly rose to the top of the suspect list. A neighbor and widower, Lorenz had once been romantically involved with Victoria and may have believed himself to be the father of young Josef. Victoria had even taken legal action demanding financial support from him. He denied the child was his, but many believed the tension between him and the Grubers ran deep. Even more suspicious, Lorenz was part of the group that discovered the bodies. When the search party reached the barn, He was reportedly the first to move the bodies, something investigators considered odd. Not just because it disturbed a crime scene, but because Lorenz had done it without hesitation. Some claimed he showed no signs of shock or grief. Others noted how he unlocked the farmhouse door using a key, suggesting prior access. When questioned, Lorenz gave conflicting accounts. At one point, he said he moved the bodies to look for survivors. Later, he claimed he did it to check if the killer was hiding underneath. But despite intense scrutiny, no evidence ever directly linked him to the murders. Other suspects were considered. Victoria's late husband's regiment, for instance, men who had served him in World War I and may have returned home twisted by war. Then there was a group of wandering craftsmen who had passed through town weeks earlier. The family's maid, killed on her first day, had replaced another who'd quit 6 months earlier due to paranormal disturbances. She told people the house was haunted, that she heard voices in the walls, footsteps in the attic. Was someone already living in the home? Investigators examined the attic more closely. They found disturbed dust, signs of bedding, and food scraps. A small hole had been carved into the attic floorboards, angled perfectly to peer into the bedrooms below. A theory began to form. Someone had been secretly living in the house, watching the family for days, perhaps weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike. The missing keys, the newspaper no one recognized, the footsteps in the ceiling. These were not random. They were warnings. They had been ignored. In a desperate move, the authorities exhumed the bodies of the Gruber family. Their heads were removed and sent to clairvoyants, mediums who claimed they could see the killer through spiritual vision. It was a sign of how hopeless the investigation had become. Nothing useful came from it. In fact, the skulls were lost during World War II and never returned. The family was eventually buried without their heads. As the case dragged on, more and more strange details emerged. Victoria had been seen at the local bank just days before the murders. She tried to withdraw a large sum of money. No one knows why. The family had also been talking about moving, escaping, starting over. Had they sensed the danger closing in? Had they waited too long? Despite dozens of leads, over 100 people were questioned, and not a single person was ever charged. In 1923, the farmhouse was demolished. The grounds were cleared, the wood burned, and the soil tilled over. But even that could not erase the legacy of Hinterkaifeck. For years afterward, locals claimed to hear whispers on the wind near the spot where the house once stood. Some said they saw flickers of candlelight between the trees at night. Others refused to walk past the site entirely. The case would be reopened several times over the next century, including a modern forensic review in 2007 by German criminology students. They analyzed the case files, maps, autopsy reports, and interviews, and came to one chilling conclusion. The killer was almost certainly Lorenz Schlittenbauer. But it was too late. He was long dead. And without hard evidence, their theory remains just that. A theory. What haunts this case isn't just the brutality of the murders. It's the closeness of it all. The killer wasn't some mysterious drifter. They weren't a ghost in the attic or a figment of folklore. They were someone the family knew. Someone who fed their animals. Someone who opened their doors, crept into their barn, waited in their home. Someone who might have waved to them days earlier in the village square. In Hinterkaifeck, it was never a question of what happened. That part was clear. The real question was, who was the killer? And how close had they really been? There are some murders so gruesome, so deeply disturbing, that the truth becomes almost impossible to separate from legend. The Hinterkaifeck murders are one of them. A century later, the facts remain horrifying, but what surrounds them is something stranger. Whispers of ghosts, cursed land, and a killer who may never have existed at all. By the time police had finished their investigation, or what little they could salvage, rumors had already consumed the village. And in small towns like Kaifeck, stories evolve quickly. They don't need facts to grow teeth. Soon it wasn't just a murder story, it was a haunting. Residents spoke in hushed tones of the maid who fled the farm months before the murders. Her name was Crescence Rieger. She had lived with the Grubers for a short time before quitting suddenly. Her reason? The house is cursed. She spoke of footsteps in the attic when no one was up there. She said she felt someone watching her at night. Doors that she locked would be open in the morning. Keys disappeared. Shadows moved. She warned Victoria that there was something in the house that didn't want her there. No one believed her, at least not until Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, was murdered on her first day. Then came the children in the village, who whispered about a man in the woods, a shadow who watched the farmhouse. One boy even claimed he saw a face staring out from the attic window the night before the murders. The chilling thing? There was no official record of anyone else being on the farm at that time. While some leaned into superstition, others pursued logic, but the theories were no less disturbing. One of the most persistent ideas was that the killer had been living in the attic, perhaps for days or even weeks before the murders. Evidence supported it. Footsteps in the dust, a hole carved into the wood providing a vantage point down into the home. Leftover scraps of food, even a blanket. But who was it? If not a stranger, then maybe someone they knew. That's where the theories start to fracture. Theory 1. The family itself. One of the most disturbing theories points inward. Some investigators believe the murders may have been committed by a family member in a fit of rage, or even as part of a planned murder-suicide. But this theory loses ground quickly. The brutality of the murders, the sequential execution of each victim, and the fact that everyone in the family was dead make it hard to justify. Unless, of course, someone had help. Could Victoria have planned to murder her father, only for things to spiral out of control? Could the incest rumors, and the possibility that Joseph was the product of it, have driven someone inside the home to madness? Theory 2. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. The most widely believed theory, both then and now, is that Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Victoria's former lover and potential father of Joseph, was the killer. He had motive. He had a history with the family. He was familiar with the farm, and he was the first person to enter the barn, even before police. What made Lorenz truly suspicious, however, were the little things. He had a key to the house. He showed no shock at the bodies. He moved them without hesitation. He gave conflicting statements in interviews. Later in life, Lorenz sued a newspaper for suggesting he was the murderer. But during the trial, he said something chilling. "If I had done it, I would have used a different weapon." That single sentence would follow him for the rest of his life. Theory 3. A vengeful outsider. Some believe the killer was a war veteran, possibly suffering from trauma or madness after World War I. The idea is that someone who served with Victoria's husband returned home and took out a long simmering grudge on the family. Others proposed a traveling criminal, someone who passed through Bavaria unnoticed. This theory is supported by the lack of clear motive. No valuables were taken, but maybe the crime wasn't about theft. Maybe it was about hate. But skeptics argue that no stranger could have navigated the farm so quietly or known the family's routines so well. Theory 4. The priest and the choir. A bizarre theory emerged years later, suggesting that the local church community had grown suspicious of Victoria's incestuous relationship and took justice into their own hands. After all, Victoria was a singer in the local choir. Was there resentment? Religious fervor? Did someone believe they were punishing sin? Oh, there's no evidence for this theory, but that hasn't stopped it from spreading. Theory 5. The Watcher in the Woods. This is the most terrifying theory, the one that takes the whispers seriously. It suggests that someone had been watching the Gruber family for weeks, maybe even living in the house and waiting for the perfect time to strike. The footprints in the snow leading to the house, but not away. The newspaper that no one brought. The footsteps in the attic. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a person. But what haunts the mind most is the silence. This person waited, listened, watched the family eat, sleep, fight, bathe, learn their rhythms, and then, calmly and without hesitation, killed them one by one, starting in the barn, ending in the crib. Who does that? And why? The farmhouse was demolished in 1923, less than a year after the murders, but the land itself was never sold. Farmers refused to till it. Locals avoided the path that once led to its door. Even today, the murder site is marked only by a simple memorial cross, weather-worn, often surrounded by overgrown grass, and rarely visited. Yet every now and then, someone leaves a candle, a sign that the ghosts of Hinterkaifeck haven't been forgotten. Over the decades, the murders have inspired books, plays, films, podcasts, and documentaries. Internet sleuths have scoured every known detail. Entire message boards are devoted to theories. Yet despite all of that effort, no one has solved the case. The 2007 re-examination by German criminology students pointed firmly to Lorenz Schlittenbauer. But without physical evidence, and with the case over 80 years cold, it meant nothing. Just more whispers, more shadows. What makes Hinterkaifeck so chilling isn't just the savagery of the crime. It's the quiet before it, the uneaten meals, the footsteps above, the unlocked doors, the face in the window no one believed they saw. In the heart of Germany, among fields once plowed and paths once walked by farmers and children, lies a field that now grows wild. No foundation remains, no building, no barn, no walls, just grass, stone, and silence. But the ghosts, they're still there. Not in the supernatural sense, but in the stories, in the questions, and in the minds of those who cannot let go. The Hinterkaifeck murders weren't just brutal. They were consuming. They didn't end when the last body was buried. They continued. In the files of cold case detectives, the dreams of villagers, and the obsessed notebooks of amateur sleuths around the world, this wasn't just a massacre. This was a mystery that refused to die. The decades passed, but the case never truly went cold. Every few years, new investigators, some official, many not, would dig up the old police records, crime scene sketches, and autopsy photos. They'd pore through witness statements and gossip. Every little contradiction was a possible breakthrough. Every photograph, a potential clue. But the same question always lingered, like a curse attached to the soil. Who? One man, Andreas Trost, a police archivist from Ingolstadt, spent nearly 20 years of his life researching the case. He had shelves filled with yellowing papers, marked up maps of the Gruber farm, and original witness statements typed on a German typewriter. His conclusion? He didn't have one. "I could write a book with 15 endings," he said in a 1991 interview, "and all of them would feel right and wrong at the same time." In 2007, the German Police Academy in Fürstenfeldbruck reopened the case as part of a criminology course. Students were given access to all surviving documents and tasked with applying modern profiling techniques. They reconstructed the timeline. They analyzed the layout of the farm. They mapped out the psychological behavior of suspects. They reached a single, dominant conclusion. Lorenz Schlittenbauer was likely the killer. But the conclusion was purely circumstantial. No physical evidence survived. The crime scene had been desecrated almost immediately, the skulls lost in war, and the farmhouse itself demolished before forensics as we know them existed. Their findings, while compelling, were simply another theory, one more whisper in a hall of echoes. Meanwhile, online, the case found new life in true crime forums, on YouTube, in podcasts and late-night threads on Reddit. The name Hinterkaifeck became legendary, a European Amityville, a historical zodiac. People from around the world began to treat it like a puzzle they could solve. They printed maps, labeled barn blueprints, debated the width of snowshoe tracks. Some believed the killer was a drifter. Others believed it was Victoria's former priest. One bizarre theory even implicated Victoria's young daughter, claiming she survived and escaped with help, despite the autopsy confirming otherwise. None of it brought resolution, only obsession. Journalists who visited the village in the 1950s and 60s found that many residents refused to talk about the murders. Some denied they ever happened. Others warned reporters not to say the word Hinterkaifeck too loudly. Even descendants of those involved remained guarded. Some changed their names. Others avoided interviews entirely. The name was a scar, and they'd learned how to live with it by burying it deep. The land where the farm once stood became known as cursed ground. Some who lived nearby claimed to hear strange sounds, moans at night, echoing footsteps. Dogs would bark at the wind. One farmer swore he saw candlelight flickering at the edge of the tree line, where no house had stood for decades. Real or not, the stories wouldn't stop. Even in death, the Gruber family couldn't escape the strangeness of the case. When their skulls were removed and sent to Munich for psychic analysis, they were lost, likely destroyed during the bombings of World War II. Today, the family lies in a grave marked only by their names. Their heads never returned. It is one of the most symbolic details in the entire case. They were buried without faces, just as their killer remains faceless, forever watching from the shadows of history. What makes Hinterkaifeck different from most unsolved cases is not just the horror, it's the intimacy. This wasn't a murder committed in a city alley, or a robbery gone wrong, or a random spree. This was slow, intentional, controlled. Whoever did this took the time to feed the animals, sleep in the victims' beds, cook in their kitchen. They didn't flee into the night. They stayed, they made themselves comfortable, for days. It is that detail that breaks people, because it suggests something more terrifying than rage or revenge. It suggests comfort with death, familiarity with the victims, an ability to live among corpses without remorse. And that is what fuels the obsession. Even today, if you walk to the spot where the Gruber farm once stood, you'll find nothing more than wild grass and an old wooden cross planted in the soil. The wind whistles there differently. Birds don't linger. There's a sense, whether imagined or real, that the ground remembers. Each year, a few visitors make the pilgrimage. Some are locals who still live in the area. Others are tourists drawn by the legend. Some say they feel nothing. Others say they feel watched. None stay long. In the end, the Hinterkaifeck murders are not just a cold case. They're a riddle, one without a clean ending or a final twist. The only thing we know for certain is this: a family died in silence. A killer disappeared without a trace. And a century later, we still can't stop asking why. The case, like the attic that watched them all, lingers overhead, unseen, unanswered, and unresolved. It whispers to us and dares us to solve it.